Let me turn to today's specific topic. As I mentioned in the introduction, when we started diving into the science behind polarization and interventions at work, one lesson that we learned was that it's most effective to work with young people. And sadly, too many of our young people think this is the only way we do politics. They assume this is normal in our country because it's the way it's been over the past 10 years. Unlike many of us in this room who may have hardened views and a style of discussing and debating, young people are more of a blank slate. They're still trying to figure out how all of this works. They want to learn about tough topics and how to debate and discuss them, but they need to be shown how to do it in the right way. Another lesson we realized is that we're not doing very well, as I mentioned, especially on our college campuses. On the one hand, we're struggling with cancel culture on our campuses. And on the other side, even when there is a robust culture of free expression, people are often obnoxious jerks, confusing political correctness or wokeness with just plain good manners. We've come to recognize that we can't disagree better if there's an environment that scares people away from political discourse entirely. In other words, toxic conflict is bad, but so is the absence of conflict altogether, right? These are opposite sides of a similar coin. So we're hopeful today that we can have a robust discussion about how we help young people to grapple through topics, to develop intellectual flexibility, humility, curiosity, empathy, and open-mindedness. We're going to start with a conversation with a leader in this space, John Tomasi. And John, if you want to go ahead and come join us up here, he's the president of the Heterodox Academy. The Heterodox Academy describes themselves as a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization of thousands of faculty, staff, and students committed to advancing the principles of open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement to improve higher education and academic research. John was previously a political philosopher at Brown University, where he was twice awarded university prizes for excellence in undergraduate teaching. He founded and directed the Political Theory Project, an independent research center at Brown that supports scholarship and encourages political dialogue on campus. He has a long list of other impressive accomplishments, but we'll simply thank him for being here today. Come on up and join me. Thank you. Good here? Yeah, perfect. How have you been?
I'm doing great.
I'm glad.
It feels really late for me because I'm at East Coast time still, so I woke up to watch the sunrise. Piece of cake. It's afternoon for me, I suppose.
It was a beautiful sunrise. Thank you,
fabulous.
Governor of Colorado. Thank you for putting on a show this morning.
I assumed it was for us.
We very much enjoyed it. So, John, as I mentioned, one of my favorite parts of college was debate. I was a political science student, and we had so much fun. Learned a lot from people who were different than me. I grew up in a small rural town, little bit sheltered, little different life. Had some very strong views, loosely held maybe when I got to college, and that's where I kind of learned what it was I believed in, my political philosophy. Learned from a lot of other people. I'm curious. Can you start by talking about Heterodox Academy's mission and why this is so important to all of us?
So I would love to tell you about HXA's mission, and I will. But if I may, I'd like to tell you about what we see the problem is.
Please.
To which we think we want to be the solution. So is it okay if I just do for a word about that? So some of you probably know that trust in higher education has been dramatically declining in the US for years. About 10 years ago, a Gallup poll showed that 57% of Americans had a positive impression of higher education, which is a fairly low number, but by comparison to today's number, those were the good old days. The poll this last summer by Gallup showed that only 36% of Americans have a positive view of higher education. If you break it up by Democrat and Republican, Republicans only have a 19% positive approval rating of university. And yet they're trying to get their kids into these schools. They're in this interesting position where they want their children to go to these places for all kinds of reasons every parent in the room can understand, and yet they're highly skeptical of these institutions. That's a bad state of affairs. And just a moment diagnosis about that state of affairs that kind of leads to what HXA is trying to do. I've worked in higher education for 27 years, and there's sort of two views of what's happening in American education, I think. On one view, I call it the battlefield perspective. And any of you who worked on campuses or maybe spent time on campuses will be familiar with the battlefield view, in which there's a lot of polarization, there's hostility, there's cancel culture, there's just a really unpleasant warfare in a sense going on these college campuses. And as I said, I've lived that world, I've seen that world from that perspective, I get that. But at HXA, we had this idea that if you elevate up a little bit and look down at what we're doing, and we've been doing over the last 30, 40, or 50 years, the big story about higher education is that our institutions have become much more inclusive. It's remarkable how recent some of these movements towards inclusion have been. Do any of you know when the Ivy League first started, the last college in the Ivy League first started graduating women? Anyone want to guess what year? 1987. That's a recent accomplishment. Racial pluralism in universities, openness to different kinds of gender, these are still new accomplishments within universities. And from that higher perspective, from that higher perspective, you might say what's happening, what we're doing, or we're watching on these campuses, all the people angry at each other and fighting with one another, it's because we're in the process, the bloody, painful process, uncertain process, of trying to give birth to something that the world has never seen. A truly inclusive university, set of university systems that's committed to pursuing truth together. That's a hard thing for humans to do. We're not built for it. We'll talk about what we're built for as we go, but we're not built for that, as I'll describe later on. But that's what we're trying to achieve. Now, I'm not saying that it's been, you can imagine, it could have done it better than we've been doing it. We can do it better, but that's a perspective that sort of animates a lot of what HXA does. We believe that an inclusive university is worth struggling for, but the inclusive university cannot give up the central purpose of the university, which is to search for truth and understanding. And we've gotten railroaded and waylaid and all kinds of weird things because of the inclusion drive away from that higher mission. So that's HXA's idea about what we're trying to do. Should I say how we're trying to do it?
Yeah, let's hear how you're trying to do it.
This isn't supposed to be a lecture.
It is supposed to be a lecture.
Oh, really?
Anyways. Yeah, I'm just up here to
I'm natural for that. I mean,
facilitate your lecture.
You put a professor on stage and say,
tell us more about how you're trying to do that.
So I'll show you some slides since now I'm a professor. So Heterodox Academy is an organization of professors, primarily professors, but we also have administrators and increasingly students who are interested in what I think of as elevating our universities from within. So rather than outsiders who criticize universities, and there are plenty of those, and they have a role to play, we're insiders who love our universities. We love them so much that we're not content to let them be the way they are. So we're people who live our lives on college campuses, who see these problems, and who sincerely want to pitch in to help presidents, help deans, help students, help our fellow faculty members play a better role in that process of giving this birth to this unusual thing. And there are 6,000 plus of us. You know, you can see we're on a lot of different campuses. We're all around the country, all around the world, but we're mainly in the US and Canada. And we have a lot of communities, virtual communities, disciplinary communities, like there's an HX economists, there's HX STEM, there's HX classics. They go online and talk about how their disciplines have been canceling people, canceling scholars who say unorthodox things, and trying to make them embrace heterodoxy, believing and reminding people that in the world of ideas especially, it's true in the world of democracy as well, but in the world of ideas in a really pure form, it's disagreement. It's people who see the world differently, who come together in constructive mechanisms, with the right institutions, to create breakthroughs. And we have something we call the HXA way. It's a way that we try to model and try to encourage others to follow as well. And that's that when you're in the academic world, and again, it transfers to other parts of our world too, but in the academic world, we should try to make our case with evidence rather than just spouting off. We should try to be intellectually charitable, look for the good in what people say, rather than the bad in which they say, which is always easy to find. Be intellectually humble. Be aware that however much you think, and professors, we all think we know a lot. I'm one of the people who thinks I know a lot. But it's good for us to remind ourselves that we don't know much. And there are people all around us who know more than we do. And you have that attitude of humility, you're opening yourself to growing. Be constructive. Critics are a dime a dozen. I love critics, don't get me wrong. Universities need critics, as I said a moment ago. But being constructive, trying to build good things, there's something noble about that in the world of ideas and in the world of politics. And then finally, kind of a weird one, but it's sort of my favorite, be yourself. Which is, don't just inhabit a role, but also let yourself shine through sometimes. And when you let yourself shine through in an environment where other people are letting themselves shine through, we see each other as human beings. And that's maybe the most powerful thing of all. A couple other things.
We need to give that list to every politician in America.
It's lovely, right?
It's great.
Yeah, my colleague John Haidt, who many of you may know, started Heterodox Academy 16 years ago. John's a social psychologist. And he came up with most of that list, that idea about how should we get along with each other better, using some findings from social psychology. When I taught at Brown for many years, and as I joked with these guys, I got up from my very comfortable tenured chair and walked away January a year ago to take this job running this small nonprofit. And I did it because I was fascinated by the potential of, at the time, 5,000 professors who believe in these ideals, what could be done with them. And one of the things we're doing is bringing together our members who were before just individuals on campuses. When I became president of HXA, membership was anonymous because a lot of our members had been attacked and criticized just for holding these views. And my first day on the job, my first edict was an email to all the members all around the world saying, from now on, you need to have your name listed on our website with your institutional affiliation. And I think we lost 200 members the first day, 300 the second day. I hardly slept the third night. I thought I'd crash this organization that I'd just taken over. But then it stopped. And we started rebuilding back up. And people who actually believed in these things enough, these principles enough to be identified as being with these values, they're the ones who stayed, and we started rebuilding. And the big thing we've been doing over the past year is we've invited our members, all of them, to find a fellow member on your campus, now that they're identifiable on our website. Find a person who wants to join with you and is willing to commit for 3 years of building a community on your campus. And we started off, we planned to have 2 or 3 in the spring semester last spring, but we got so many great applications we couldn't turn them down, so we accepted like 36. We just added 15 more. And you can see on the map there, we're going to have these campus communities. And these are communities now of professors. The biggest group is at Harvard, there are 53 there. Actually, the biggest group was at Harvard, there are 53 there, until we started one at Western Michigan University, which had about 30, I think, at the time. Western Michigan has been one of the places where they've been really aggressive about recruiting other members. They're now at 65 or so, they're now the biggest campus community. But these communities are professors and administrators who meet together on a regular basis, who are starting to hold events on their campuses, modeling good behavior, who work with other organizations, some of whom are in this room, to encourage all the different kind of players to come together and magnify our powers. And they also do important things I'll talk about later on about helping their university presidents govern better by serving on committees and making proposals to actually encourage the institutions that you need that will allow disagreeing to actually happen well. And I think I have one more slide. I'll save this for a minute maybe. This is a few examples of people that I can talk about if you like. Should I do that now?
John. Yeah, let's hold on that. Let me ask you. I have a question.
Lecture has to end at some point.
No. This is perfect. This is perfect. Look, I want to go back to something you said in your introduction. Sure. You were talking about kind of the higher purpose of higher education, the search for truth.
Yeah.
One of your colleagues, the president of Johns Hopkins, wrote a book a couple of years ago with a provocative title. I think it was something like "What Universities Owe Democracy."
I know.
Right?
Yes.
So. Can you help us? What do? I mean, the whole premise of this gathering is that is that higher ed owes something to democracy, or we wouldn't be having this meeting. But what is it that you think universities owe to this problem specifically, this polarization, the failure of democracy that we're seeing across our country?
Yeah, I think that's the kind. I love that book, and I love the project that he decided to do that. So, university president, he's busy and he's thinking about those civic questions. I think you can see the answer best by looking at the failure. So if you look what universities don't provide and what that does to our society, then you can see better what it should provide, what they should provide, and what that might mean for our society. If young people finish college walking out thinking they know the answers to all the moral problems in the world, which a lot of young people do. Some people think of it in a really militaristic way where they're out there, really doing it, but a lot of people just more passively think that they know the answers to all the questions in the world because morality is simple, good is good, and evil is evil, and that's just the way the world is. If we produce generations of people who finish that way, finish college that way, and enter our society that way, it's a bad sign for our future as a democracy. You need to have more flexible people. Democracies need to have people who are capable of creativity. Democracies need to have people, I think most of all, who are impatient with the status quo, who are restless about these inherited institutions, who take that idea from Lincoln. Lincoln has this wonderful phrase that I just love. He talks about America's business being unfinished. Unfinished. And in a sense, a great society, like every institution, large and small, every university, but great societies too, are always in a process of becoming. We're never given as being one fixed thing forever. Every institution is constantly changing. How do we change? We change based on what the people within these institutions, each generation, do or they don't do. So universities, I think we're sort of seeing in the breach what they need to do by producing people who think there are easy answers to the question, who think that identity, I'll give you a couple more specific examples about some of the ideas. There's a powerful view on universities that identity is everything. That if you see a person, you can put them into a category, and you now know a lot about them. And you also know all you need to know what to do politically. Because along with the identity view, there's a simplistic idea that there are oppressors and oppressed in the world. And you put someone into a category group, identity group, and that comes with the label oppressor or oppressed, and that's all you need to know about the world now. And we've seen some of the fruits of that, I think, very destructive mentality in the reaction to the Hamas attacks. I mean, and from both directions, all directions, a kind of a simplistic idea that you know what these answers are before you actually delve into the histories, the problems, and develop the nuance that you need in a free society. So in universities, we're searching for truth and understanding for the purpose of truth and understanding. But in free societies, too, I think, we're searching for understanding. We're searching for growth. We're searching for a mentality that brings allies aboard to share their ideas with us, to improve the way we think. So universities owe everything to our societies because the idea of a free society and democracy in a free society, a free liberal society, is so tied to the ideals, those ideas of humility, of working together, of seeing every person as being a person with rights, whose values, as every person as being a human being whose interests matter. Those are fundamental ideas of epistemology, thinking and theorizing, but they're also fundamental ideas of political life.
Thank you. You keep using the word humility, and it seems to be so lacking in our political discourse today. John Adams used the same term: patience, humility, moderation.
Nice.
We see so little of that these days. Some of our partners. More in Common and Constructive Dialogue, doing amazing work at the Constructive Dialogue Institute. They did some research recently that I thought was fantastic. They were looking at attitudes of college students towards free expression, and it was fascinating, not in a good way, the powerful force that social pressure is playing in these environments. I was just at Harvard a few weeks ago, spoke to the students. I actually met with the conservative caucus there on campus there like unicorns. They're very rare. A few of them
I was going to say, how many were
popped
there?
up. There were 5 or 6 of them that came to the meeting, and they were talking about some of those social pressures that they felt in class to not speak up when they when they wanted to. How can we empower students to help create the right environment where we don't formally outlaw certain views, but rather encourage hearing and engaging those views that are different?
It's in many ways.
It's at the core of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, in many ways, it's the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah.
We think at HXA, we think that open research is really important too, and that's a topic I won't say much about. I don't think today, but I just want to make a note here that when in the realm of science, for example, is most clear, we need scientific breakthroughs to make our world a better place. And insofar as science is being policed for certain ways of thinking, the implications for society and for the least well-off people in the world in particular are catastrophic. The opportunities for breakthroughs that could really help people's lives in medicine and technology, these are just incredibly important things for humanity, often affecting the least well-off most. I'll give you one small example. There's a lab at MIT a big lab at MIT working on a project to make soybeans that have a shell casing that's easier to remove. Sounds like, well, some of you from the West may know these things are important, but it's incredibly important that they get this breakthrough down right. If you can shell soybeans more cheaply, you can drop the price of soybeans, which is incredibly important for poor people, especially in the world. But there's some pushback in some of these labs to have certain kind of filterings and certain kinds of limitations on speech and all kinds of politics that are preventing that pursuit of those scientific norms. But back to the students, which is more the point here. HXA Head Academy does large national surveys. Our biggest survey is called the Campus Expression Survey. And we canvass students all across the country to find out how they're feeling about their role on campus and their experience on campus. And one of the striking things we find, you alluded to it, is that students report that they're aware that their professors tend to lean left. That's always been the case in America. It's more the case now than it used to be, by the way. And there's some reason to think that if you break it up by generation, the younger professors are even more skewed in one direction than the older professors, which worries a lot of us about where we're going in 10 or 20 years. But we'll deal with that in 10 or 20 years, I suppose. But one of the things we find is that students report that they're not censoring themselves so 74% of students report self-censoring. So they don't say what they're thinking because they don't want to put it out there. That is, just hold on that for a second, think what that means, right? You've probably done, we've done it ourselves, each one of us, around certain dinner tables or whatever. We don't say something because, you know what, it's not worth like the pushback. But now you're in a college classroom with a question put in front of you by a professor because the topic's important for your learning. And instead of saying what you think, instead of trying out an idea and exploring some new terrain that might trigger a thought in some other student and some new thing might happen that's important to all of us, you just keep quiet. Why do they keep quiet? It's not because they're afraid of their professors, their left-wing professors giving them bad grades. There's some of that. But the overwhelming thing they report is that they're afraid of each other, especially in social media. They're afraid of making that comment in class, trying out an idea in this space of intellectualism, and then seeing it popped up on X the next day, and their lives are ruined, their social lives and other lives are ruined. So the self-censorship is a really major thing, and it comes from a lack of trust. I believe that it comes from a lack of trust in adults, a lack of trust in the professors in the room who don't do the work they need to do, who don't understand that as our university campuses become more inclusive, inclusivity is hard won. It requires extra work in the civic space to maintain those open conversations. Some of our older members talk about the good old days where they could go on campus and say anything they wanted and have these open conversations late into the night. I'm not sure there ever were really good old days. But one thing about the good old days is that they tended to be a pretty homogeneous group compared to today of people having these conversations. As communities become more diverse, more deeply diverse, and we accept that diversity, so that marginalized groups feel more confident and more able to speak openly about their positions, it's more conflict, and it takes more skills to make us be able to navigate all that. Giving birth is a complicated process, and we're not doing a terribly good job of it.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how I think dangerous that is, the self-censoring piece, because I know, again, just in my own experience, sometimes I will speak an idea that even I don't agree with, but I have to work it out, and that's one way we work it out is by putting the idea out there and then examining it and getting some pushback on it. But if you're not willing to do that, ideas can't progress, they can't improve, and they can't mate. I mean, there's a lot of research about how an idea comes out, another idea comes out, then it triggers something else in our brains, and we can actually solve problems. But now with self-censoring, we're not even doing that.
And can I say something?
Yeah, please.
So that's a big piece of it, about cross-pollination of ideas is where creativity comes from. But there's another idea that's sometimes we don't think about as much. And John Stuart Mill in the 1850s wrote a book called On Liberty. There's a chapter in that book where he talks about freedom of expression, which is a really brilliant essay even now. But one of the points John Stuart Mill makes is that even when we have a truth, even when as a society we've seized on some set of truths like all men are created equal or something like that, and it's a strong, true belief, if that belief is not challenged, if we're not forced to think about that belief in fresh ways, we hold it as a dead dogma rather than as a living truth. And an example Mill gives is that he talks about the way the first generation of Christians held their beliefs compared to the way some older generations, not all obviously, but some they sort of say the things, but they don't really know what it means. And Mill thinks that societies need to have constant challenges, even for settled truths, so that we'll hold the truths in the right way. And there's also a danger of them being lost if they're not being held in the right way.
Yeah, that's powerful, powerful.
And, and some of our members, do things on their campuses to work on those problems that I can talk about if you like.
Good. I do. In fact, I do want to talk about this. We want to make sure there's time for questions from the audience. So in the next 5 minutes before we open up for questions, I do want to hear some case studies. Let's go there. Let's have you talk about some real life examples.
Can I put this slide up on the?
I'll throw that up.
So I just grabbed a couple people's faces from my membership group. These are some people who are doing really interesting things, and I picked Western ones.
Yes, you did.
So I'll just mention three very briefly. Nafis. Nafis is an assistant professor at Boise State. These are all HXA members. You'll notice that they're all assistant professors. We're interested in any members, of course, but we're especially interested in younger members who are going to have long careers in the university, investing in them, investing time with them, learning from them. But Nafis, for example, and we empower our community members. So we have communities on these campuses now, and we empower them they know the terrain of their university best. They know what's possible there, and they choose very different paths towards reforming their university. So Nafis started something called the point-counterpoint teaching philosophy, which is going to sound pretty obvious. So the idea of point-counterpoint teaching philosophy is simply that in his classrooms, his students first argue for their own position, and then they're required to argue for the contrary position. Pretty obvious, right? But what Nafis emphasizes with them is that the first step, arguing for your own position, is a lot more difficult than most people think. Most of us believe things we believe for reasons we don't even fully know very well. But if you're required to now by a professor to stop and really pause, to think to yourself, well, why do I believe that? What are the experiences of my life that made me come to this set of convictions? How did my course of life, my family, my books I read, things I saw, things that happened to my friends, how did I come to hold these beliefs? Once you do that, then when you do the second part, asking how someone else could hold some contrary view, you start realizing they lived a different life than I've lived. They've had different families than I had. They've read a different book. They had a friend with a different crisis. They're human beings too. And it does this remarkable thing that Nafis is a master at it. It does this remarkable thing in these classrooms where by reflecting on the fact that each of us got to our views because of the life we've led, we see that in other people too. And that's a really powerful way to start making connections across difference.
Let me just underscore that a little
Isn't
bit.
that great?
There's some research out there that shows that adults who participated in debate in high school or college, where they were required to argue, you're given a topic and the side you're arguing, right? So abortion, whether you're for or against it, they don't care. You have to argue the side. By learning to argue the other side of something, those adults are much less polarized than the rest of the country. So this skill, it helps all of us to see things from a different point of view.
And I know those studies, and what those studies are pointing to is something really important, is the cognitive element, the thinking part, because on those studies, what they're emphasizing is that when you see why someone else has reasons for holding the view they do, you often notice that your reasons and their reasons are kind of the same, so you have a common base, you take them in different directions, which is a really powerful, that's how a lot of politics works, right? People think to themselves, what's common ground between these two warring sides? Do you agree with this premise? I agree with it too. Now let me move you to my side, which is super powerful. The Nafis angle is a little bit different because he's really talking about what's a human being? What does it mean to have a view at all? Where does it come from? And it's the same for each one of us. It comes from our lives. You want another example?
Yeah, give us one more. Give us one more.
I'll pick Matt Burgess. So Matt is a remarkable person. He's a professor up the road. And he's a really striking person in his research. He works in climate science. He's so committed to climate science that he's willing to work in this landmine-filled field to ask hard questions about climate science models. Which ones are too hot? Which ones are too cold? He's just an incredible pioneer in terms of modeling to older professors what it means to be an open-minded scholar who's so committed to finding the truth, so aware of how hard these problems are, that he's not willing to take the easy road. And there's a lot of pressure from government agencies, for granting agencies, to take a particular set of views on these questions. Matt pushes back against that. But the thing I want to talk about with you today, he's also a campus community leader for HXA. And Matt had started this thing called the Monthly Dialogue Series. And the way Matt did it was not just at UC Boulder, but he decided to make linkages across 5 other area schools and build communities of conversation across these different schools. So Matt's Monthly Dialogue Series connects students at UC Denver, the University of Denver, Colorado Mesa University, Colorado State, and UC Boulder. And he brings professors and students together across these different university campuses, sometimes in person, sometimes virtually, to have these conversations, again, to widen the circle of we, widen the circle in which people think of themselves as a collective, as a we, as a group of citizens, or a group of scholars, to have these kind of conversations. And again, it's just another very different path than the one Nafis. Nafis is sort of a deep dive into who you are and how you got to be the person you are. And Matt's doing a more of a institutional structural building. One I'll just mention super briefly, Kate Johnson is working at Wyoming, working closely with the president's office to develop some institutional norms about free expression and constructive disagreement, to try to help the university president formulate wiser policies. They often have activists, these university presidents, forcing them to do certain kinds of programming that aren't really well thought out, aren't really based on science. And what Kate and some others are doing are trying to bring some sophistication to that president's office, to the question, what should a freshman orientation look like? What should it include, what should it not include? They do polling, they get evidence about what works and what doesn't work, rather than just thinking, well, this sounds good, or it's PC, let's do it. No, they really dig in to see what works and what doesn't work, because they're caring about this ideal of an inclusive university where truth is being sought together. So those are 3 very brief examples. I could multiply them easily.
Yeah, thank you, John. Those are powerful and very helpful. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we want you to ask some questions. So you have an expert here. What would you like to talk about? Please, over here.
So we've talked a lot about what professors can do to foster this ideology. What do you think students can do on the college campus to further extend this ideology?
Yeah, so they can do a lot. I mean, there's something about, young people, I think, get a bad rap on college campuses. There is a closed-mindedness and a kind of a familiar arrogance that you see among young people. But there's also this wonderful thing that I notice again and again with every group of 18-year-olds who first steps foot on a college campus every fall. they're kind of impatient with the status quo. They're kind of cheeky. They kind of like pushing against things. And when they're being told we know all the answers already, come onto campus and just repeat what we think you should say because we already figured it all out before you got here, that doesn't sit well with 18-year-olds, generally speaking. And I'll just give one quick anecdote that really guides almost everything that I do. A few years ago, I had two students at Brown who were both juniors, who have become very prominent people on the campus. One was they both had opinions columns in the student paper, and one of them was a Democratic columns supporting the Democratic Party's platform. He was also very tall, literally a supermodel, would go around and wear clothes and get paid for doing that. Like, he was probably the most popular person on campus. And he was with another student who was the college Republican at Brown, who would write the bold and well-written essays every week or two about mainstream positions from the Republican platform, which at Brown it meant he'd get no dates and was not a supermodel or whatever. And they came to me because they had designed a class because they wanted to know, they hadn't learned yet, how any intelligent person could be a Republican. And so they devised, these two people have been meeting privately, devising their own syllabus for a course they wanted to see taught at Brown, which I eventually sponsored for them, to dig into these conservative readings, not to learn conservative thought for the sake of conservative thought, but just to get deeper in their understanding about these things. And the thing that I want to share with you is, one of them, the supermodel, said to me, when he told me why he wanted to have this course taught, he said this. He said, "We did not come to campus merely to become more skillful defenders of some inherited ideology. We came to think new ways and for ourselves." And that's it's a classic 18, 19, 20-year-old viewpoint. We didn't come here merely to become more skillful defenders of some inherited ideology. And that's how they both had done it up to that point. They wrote really great essays on the platform of both political parties. But that's not why they came there. They came there to be leaders. And what does it mean to be a leader for a young person or for an old person too? A leader is a person who tries to build bridges where chasms exist. But as we always say at HXA, you can't build a bridge to the other side unless you've actually gone over there and genuinely scouted out the terrain in a serious way. Otherwise, you'll build a fake bridge from your side and it won't connect over there. But if you go there and study the terrain with humility and seriousness, you may find some opportunities to do some new things that our country needs. And I'm answering your question in a kind of an abstract way, but there is an impulse among students. We find it at HXA, a lot of our campus community leaders soon find themselves working with students who come up with ideas like that, new ways of thinking about institutions they can have on their campus, inviting braver angels, inviting other groups onto campus to showcase ways of bridging divides, but more important, being explorers for something new, restoring the excitement of learning into college campus. It's pretty dull if you arrive on a college campus and people start lecturing you about the truth that they've already figured out before you even got there. But it's pretty darn exciting if you go to a college campus and you meet professors who say to you, "I don't have all the answers. I know a lot of stuff about history, I know a lot of stuff about economics, but we don't know as a society how to make our world a better place yet. We're fumbling in the dark, doing our best to make it a more just society. We don't even know what justice is fully. Join us in this adventure. Let's try to do something about it together." That's exciting for young people. It's exciting for old people too, I think.
Love it. Thank you. Other questions? Please, in the back.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That's quite enlightening. I love the fact that you've got this in the academic environment. Have you given thought how to take it out into the rest of the world? I'm not going to call it the real world, but I will say the rest of the world.
I have my hands full with the universities, to be honest. So HXA really does focus on universities. Our mission is to, as I say, elevate universities from within, to restore them to this place of respect that they should have in a free society. So that's really our focus. But we're certainly aware that the work we do on campuses, or the work that's not done on campuses, has implications for the wider society. And again, the events of October 7th have been such a seismic impact, something from the real world on our campuses, that there are lots of pathways between what's happening on the campuses and now what's happening out in the world. I could say more about that, but I think, so we do it more, HXA is really focused on the universities, but we're not unaware that we're thinking about creating citizens too. We're influencing who they are, how they're gonna engage with one another, what kind of coalitions they might be willing to find or not find when they leave the campus.
I'll just put a plug in for Jonathan Haidt, who's got 2 books coming out, I think, in the near future. So back here, we've got, go ahead, Paul, since you've got the microphone. Well, we'll go Paul, and President, we'll come back to you.
John, I'd be interested to hear your comments about how this applies to sectarian campuses, where there may be creedal commitments and the desire to pass on a tradition, as well as have a rich learning experience.
That's great. Yeah, that's something that we're talking a lot about at HXA right now. So some of you have probably been following when the Hamas attacks happened. University presidents who've been very much in the habit of making making statements about social issues were suddenly silent because they weren't sure what to say about that particular instance. Then when they started making statements condemning the Hamas attack, most of them, they started being criticized by some of their donors, and they stopped making statements. They started doing all different kinds of things. So at HXA, we're interested in sort of preserving certain kinds of norms. For example, the idea that university presidents should adopt a position of neutrality. They should let the students and the professors, as individuals, wide freedom to express their own views about these controversial political issues, rather than the president moving in first and making statements. I mentioned that to you, I'll connect that now to your question, because I was giving a talk about this ideal of institutional neutrality in Madrid a couple weeks ago. And at the end of my talk, a Catholic priest who is a provost at a Catholic university in Rome stood up and said, well, institutional neutrality sounds great, but are you saying this is true for Catholic universities too? And there are these set of principles that some of you probably know about, the Chicago principles, about free speech, also about institutional neutrality, and also about merit, these three very famous Chicago reports that we call the Chicago trifecta. Those reports are sort of guidelines for most of us who care about improving our educational systems. But none of them addresses Paul's question. None of them addresses the question of, well, how should each of these documents or these ideals be interpreted in light of the particular university's missions and goals? Universities are all about searching for truth, but there's all kinds of doctrinal and creedal commitments that are also important. There's also historical differences at Oberlin, or if you're at Yeshiva University and the Hamas attack happens, you may have a different obligation to speak than if you're at some other type of university. And I think there's a lot of variation, taking these general principles, and again, realizing, this is my theme throughout, realizing that the truth is going to be more complex and more contextualized than any principle can capture. And yet, there is power in principles. We need to find ways, we try to encourage people to find ways to be principled about free speech, to be principled about neutrality, but to do so in ways that are gentle, that are humble, that are open to softness on the edges, to let people find their own ways based on their own principles. Doesn't mean they're going to get it right. They'll probably get it wrong a lot of the time. But it's the power of living as a leader to engage in that statesmanship, to make decisions about how your doctrinal commitments at your school say you should interpret some free speech statement from Chicago, for example. Not every place is University of Chicago. You know, maybe we should all be more like Chicago, perhaps, but not completely like Chicago. That'd be a great loss.
Thank you. Last question over here, please.
First, thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
As a university president, I'm aware of the research on self-censorship, and it deeply concerns me. I've heard about it from our students and also from our faculty who experience that as well. How would you encourage both bravery and humility among our students and faculty?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, there are sort of two approaches, I think. One approach is the one that Nafis is working on, which is sort of a more direct, individual, person-by-person outreach to encourage people to care enough about their university, to care enough about the problems, to ask tough questions and to be brave. So there really is an element of that. And HXA, before I became president, was really focused on that kind of approach. It kind of came from John Haidt's social psychological background, where we say, you can give social permission to others by standing up and being brave yourself. And as a society where people are willing to stand up, professors or students, and be brave, you get these dynamic effects that are really positive. But I'm increasingly believe that, and I read a lot of social change theory, and social change theory suggests that the importance of institutions should not be underestimated. So being aware of what incentives are out there, what disincentives are out there. When a professor is fired for speaking out in some way, that sends a chilling effect across all the faculty in the country, frankly. Recently, some of you may have been following the case of Scott Gerber, a professor at Miami Northern University, a law professor who spoke out against some of the inclusion programs at his university, and he was let go for lack of collegiality, just fired. And there's many other events, you all I'm sure could name some cancellations as well. Those kinds of decisions by college presidents cast a pall across all of the university system. It makes it harder for anyone to stand up and be brave. So you have to have institutional changes. You have to call presidents to account when they make bad decisions or fail to do the right thing. So it's a mixture of evangelical work one by one, the kind of work Nafis does, collegial evangelicism, but there's also room for institutional changes. Without the right institutions in place, this is one of the great lessons of American history, without the right institutions in place, diverse societies will just be at war. But if you can devise the right kinds of institutions, you can take these differences, let them be different, and magnify to the benefit of everyone. Finding those institutions is the secret sauce of liberal societies, and it's the secret sauce of universities too. And we're still struggling to find them, and they may very well be different at different places. But that's the project that we're engaged in on the institutional side, finding ways that allow people to disagree better, and for us all to reap the rewards of them doing that.
John, you've been incredibly kind to be here with us today. Thank you
my honor.
For sharing your work and your vision. It's more important than ever. We're hoping we can magnify what you're doing all across the country.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give John a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.